This is episode 373 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I am Paul Gessing.
And I am Wally Drangmeister.
Sorry, Wally,
No
president of the
problem.
Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. And Wally, it's the midpoint of the legislative session right at today, 30 days.
Yeah, not a lot has happened. I believe, is it today or tomorrow is the last day to introduce new bills, so we'll actually know maybe what's going to happen. But keep in mind, there's always a thing called a dummy bill out there. If they really want to get something at the last minute, they always leave themselves a safety hatch. But not a lot has happened right now, is my sense. What do you think, Paul?
Well, that is kind of the overarching theme so far of this legislative session. Normally, I would say yes. Not having stuff happen is
It's
a
a good
win.
thing,
Yeah,
yeah.
that is a win. But as a few media reports, and as we speak here on Tuesday morning, February the 1st, governor's agenda stalls midway through the session. That is the front top story at the Albuquerque Journal. Santa Fe, New Mexican had a similar story in the paper yesterday, and I was quoted in that one. The problem is that this is a governor who has, quote unquote, caught religion. She has moved herself and some of her agenda to the right, and I'm not talking, we're not talking Rio Grande Foundation. This is everything we want, but on some crime issues, she's moved to the right. On Social Security, she threw that out in her State of the State address. That's definitely a priority of ours. Gross receipts tax reduction, and the hydrogen hub, which I know, Wally, you've looked at more carefully, but she's having a welcoming and open legislature when it comes to things like presumably the voting bill, free college, and a variety of left-wing priorities. But she's struggling to get more moderate to center-right priorities through a progressive legislator. Who would have thunk, Wally? Who would have thunk?
Yeah, and it's interesting. We've talked, Paul. Yes, far left things have moved, and even her signature items like the hydrogen hub, which was something that she was really highly supportive of, it's on the table in the House right now. The first committee tabled it, and it's interesting. Politics is an interesting thing. A mix of Democrats and Republicans voted to table it. So, you wonder what the issue is. The enviros say that this is perpetuates fossil fuels and is a gift to oil and gas. And yet the Republicans voted to table it and the progressive Democrats voted to table it. And, Paul, just because something gets tabled doesn't mean it's dead. It could come through through the Senate and back to the House. It could get taken off the table if deals are made. But right now, that one in particular provides tax benefits for the production of hydrogen as long as it's then sequestered, put underground permanently. It's one of those things that we have a lot of environmental energy things going on here in New Mexico. Not all of them necessarily are put in rank order of likelihood of being successful or effective, but they're there, and that one right now is not there being acted upon by the legislature, at least as we talk about this on February 1st.
And just to be clear on the hydrogen hub, and that's something that the far left environmental groups have universally and vociferously opposed. It pretty much ran into universal opposition from a lot of the left-wing base of the governor immediately. More conservative-minded fossil fuel, oil and gas people, I think a lot of them are agnostic. Some of them are more sympathetic. Others are just kind of not interested in it. So you have that very strong interest group expressing themselves very strongly in the hydrogen case hasn't really maybe been picked up by more conservative folks who are like, Yeah, we know that the governor, the legislature, in their current forms are going to come after oil and gas and a lot of future legislation, past legislation, but I just don't think they're sold on the idea of the hydrogen hub as a real future for their industry. Am I missing something with that?
No, I think that is the case, and there's a couple of things. There's the likelihood of it happening. There's the will it make a meaningful impact with regard to the volumes, or are there other things that are better than quote taking methane and turning it into hydrogen and then sequestering the carbon? There's talk of doing carbon capture and sequestration on natural gas fired power plants at some point. So might there be better ways? And the answer is for electricity generation, that is distinctly possible. But also this hydrogen, what's it going to be used for? It looks like two things. It's going to be used for electricity generation and at some point possibly used for transportation, initially large trucks. But what is the market for it and how's all that going to work out? And it's amazing how these things ebb and flow, but I don't think the oil and gas industry sees that potentially as the short term fix for any issue that they have right now. So we'll have to see. But again, on the table, will it come off? Will it get will it get some support? And does the governor have the political strength to get the Democrats to even support it, particularly in the House?
Exactly. Wally will deviate from the legislature for just a moment. We'll come back to it. But as is usually the case, COVID always plays a leading role in our conversations. Before I get started on that and go down that path, quick note from worldometers.info. Deaths per million. We follow these data pretty closely. New Mexico currently 16th highest rate. We actually surpassed Oklahoma recently. We are at 3,078, Oklahoma 3,044, Florida at 3,039, and South Dakota down at 20th, still below 3,000. New Mexico continues to struggle with COVID, and we'll see where things take us very soon. The governor has a latest executive order or health order on February the 4th. That is the expiration. And that's notable, Wally, mostly because on February the 4th, if she does renew for another month, that will take us very close to the full 2 years of COVID lockdowns. And I would be, as I have been, not stunned or stunned, depending on your perspective, if she does not renew the health order on February the 4th. I would be absolutely shocked and amazed.
Yeah, and we're seeing kind of around the world, we're starting to see the first indications that countries are saying the pandemic is now endemic. This is something we need to learn to live with and starting to get rid of these things. Also, we're starting to see things like a John Hopkins report that the impact on death rate for lockdowns, shutdowns, whatever you call them, has been infinitesimally small, but the damage caused by them, economic as well as learning and school children, has been very high. So it seems to me that regardless of what you have done in the past, there will come a time pretty soon where that probably will not be the case, but it's been a safe bet to this point to always have these health orders extended time and time again. And so if that changes here in 3 days, it will be pretty big news here in New Mexico.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm sure we'll be in this for a little while longer. We will see. Now we presumably will get past this Omicron situation in the not too distant future as we hit spring and summer. But of course, there is an election looming as well, and that certainly will come into, I believe, the governor's purview in terms of how she makes decisions moving forward. But one governor in California, and to her limited credit, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham walks the walk. She shows up in the N95 mask. She is very, very serious, especially these days, to COVID-19 issues. Early, she had her little cloth mask, and now that everybody's saying you need a more real mask, she's dutifully signed up for that. But another blue state governor, Gavin Newsom, he really does not care very much. He flouts the laws pretty much on the regular. And I don't know, Wally, I know you're a football fan, but I don't know if you saw the games over the weekends. Fabulous football games, by the way. But the LA Rams took on the San Francisco 49ers. So a battle of California, in Los Angeles. Gavin Newsom and a whole host of celebrities showed up for the game. I think Leonardo DiCaprio had the most eloquent chin diaper just below his mouth, but very few of the celebrities, and including Magic Johnson, who one could argue that he might have some immune compromise issues. But Governor Gavin Newsom, no mask to be found, not just when he was hanging out with Magic Johnson, but really not at all. And I'd love your comment on this, Wally. He did survive a recall handily, but he's up for re-election in the not too distant future. Is this just I'm in such a blue state, it doesn't matter how big of a hypocrite I am. Kids show up in school on Monday with a mask on. I'm going to party here and hang out with no mask on. Or does he just not have the self-conscious factor that Michelle Lujan Grisham does, that she's going to push the masks and at least live by the masks?
Yeah, Paul, I've thought about that a lot when it comes to policies like this. Is hypocrisy just something that just doesn't register with him? It's one of those things. It's like, does he just hear a buzzing sound when somebody talks to him about that? And you're right, he handled the recall election handily, but things reached their tipping point, and my sense is that Gavin Newsom is not close to the tipping point in the great state of California, or the People's Republic of California, depending on how you view that state. But that doesn't mean that the progressive goodwill is limitless, and that people won't, at some point say enough of this guy. So yeah, I wasn't able to see the games, but I certainly saw the pictures in news reports with the governor and Magic Johnson there, happy as can be. Meanwhile, maybe down in the stands, in the less pricey tickets, if you're to take your mask off, maybe somebody in the security would come talk to you, and that's what's really stunning. It doesn't even need to be separated by very much time or space to just see total disparate treatment.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on this, which I agree with everything you just said. And of course, Newsom was famously at the French Laundry restaurant, a very high-end, hoity-toity place, when COVID was at one of its many peaks. But here is a note. I'm looking at a news article about the Super Bowl, which is back in LA. So the Rams will be playing in their home stadium in that game. Los Angeles County Public Health Director said every fan attending next month's Super Bowl at SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California, will be given a KN95 mask, and extensive outreach will be done to remind attendees to wear their masks at all times during the game, except when eating or drinking.
Well, yeah, extensive outreach. Does that mean people, what does that mean? People with billy clubs and pistols are going to come pistol whip you if you don't have your mask on, or are they just going to shake their finger at you as you come in the door? It'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, well,
and I have a cup in my hand, so I'm drinking, Paul. So I don't know.
Well, and I know COVID is such a rabbit hole. We can always go down this rabbit hole, but the commercials that the Department of Health have been running are absurd, and I cannot recall a time when I saw such overt propaganda being pushed through these ad campaigns. Unbelievable.
And that's the
stuff.
New Mexico Department of Health.
New Mexico Department of Health. Yeah, sorry, I jumped back here. We can only talk about California politics for so long on this podcast.
And then our heads will explode if we keep talking.
Yeah, but I just saw also a report from the AP, NMSU, at their basketball games, suspended concession sales at the Pan Am Center to increase mask compliance. Now, I cannot imagine in LA at the Super Bowl them not forcing you to pay the $20 for a beer and $15 for a soda pop. But at NMSU, at New Mexico's highest institution of higher learning, they have decided that they're just going to get rid of concessions to essentially give people no excuse in order to comply with the indoor mask mandate. So this kind of stuff, we think of the Omicron and the virus itself as kind of, maybe that's because of the political and educational attainment we have. We just feel this is finally moving into the background in real terms. But the health officials, the politicians, they are very much still clinging to this issue.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So, there's all kinds of fans at a NMSU basketball game, but the students in particular, they're going to go in the student section, have their masks on, and then after they go back to their dorm rooms and their fraternities, they'll take their masks off and be in parties with, as they say in New Mexico State, and when we win this game, we'll buy a keg of booze and we'll drink it to the Aggies till we wobble in our shoes. And that usually is done without masks, sorry to say.
Oh, amazing. Well, up in Canada, the truckers have had enough, and good for them. But there is a freedom convoy going on in Canada. You've probably seen some news reports on it. It's something that directly, I believe, the Canadian truckers are concerned about mandatory vaccines to cross the border between the United States and Canada. This is one of those, we think of governments as having differing policies. Well, internationally, especially, where they can kind of keep you in their clutches and make life difficult for you. It's something that's kind of a joint approach by the Canadian and U.S. governments. And Canadian truckers have had enough. They are headed to Ottawa, and they're going to be protesting for the foreseeable future. It'll be very interesting. Of course, I think some copycat convoys, and copycat in the best possible way, here in the United States are in the offing. And definitely truckers, I think, rightly feel, why are we being forced into compliance with these kinds of things? Because by their nature, truckers spend the majority of their working hours in an isolation chamber known as the semi-truck. It's very hard to see how or why the government, based on any scientific analysis, should be forcing them, whether it's masks, which have also been pushed, but all the vaccines themselves, just totally unnecessary. And these people do carry a very important part of our state's economy with them, our nation's economy with them. And if they have a cohesive point to make, that could be an interesting addition to our supply chain challenges, Wally.
Oh, absolutely, Paul. And in places like Europe, many in France come to mind, that when the truckers aren't happy, they have basically work stoppages, slowdowns, general strikes. And you think the supply chain problems we have now, if the truckers are not on board, or if that spreads in a big way, things could go south in a big hurry. The other thing that's interesting is that they, in Ottawa, the federal capital of Canada, they were going to use towing companies to tow some of these trucks out of the way for protesting around the Capitol. And lo and behold, all the towing companies had COVID, and so, quote unquote, and couldn't come. But yeah, this is an interesting development. And as you say, who other than truckers, are more isolated from their fellow man for the majority of hours a day than truckers. And, again, we know the science, we know the data that there are some positives to the vaccines, but it's certainly, at a minimum, the story changes continually. So, is it one of those things where you should be forced to comply? A good number of truckers in Canada and the U.S. are starting to say no.
Yeah, now we'll kind of dovetail back in from COVID into the New Mexico legislature, because as you know, Wally, and listeners to this show will know that the Rio Grande Foundation's top priority for the last several years has been to address the incredible power wielded by governors in New Mexico over emergencies. We want the legislature to have a seat back at the table. Legislation, constitutional amendments, bipartisan, all in the 60-day session did not go anywhere. So far, things are not looking good, but a new approach through the Senate. Greg Baca has introduced a proposal which would constrain the governor and give a seat at the table to the legislature. And by governor, I mean this governor in the future or future governors. SB 196 is the bill. It would require legislative approval for emergencies in duration of more than 45 days. I don't give this bill a particularly high chance of passage, but I promise you, dear listeners, as we head towards November, the Rio Grande Foundation will be actively engaged in making sure that all voters in New Mexico know who is willing to essentially forfeit their power as a legislator, as a duly elected official representing the people. This whole democracy thing you keep hearing about from these left-wingers, they want to change all the rules. Well, maybe just having the legislature play a role in the public policy making apparatus of New Mexico would be a nice concept.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but the executive branch, the governor administers the laws and the bureaucracy. The legislature makes the laws, and the courts are the ones that rule on the constitutionality of laws. And we've kind of gotten a little bit lost there. We have a lot of executive orders where laws are being made by one person, and at the federal level, and believe me, virtually every state has a identical, and many have a virtually identical system to the federal, and those that don't are similar, and they have a separation of duties, checks and balances, and that has gotten out of whack. And this is not just on this issue, but this is one exposure that these quote unquote executive orders, and I get to decide things without a legislature passing a law, really exposed in great amounts during the COVID era.
Yeah, that's what they told me on Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like that's where I learned it there. So
think
that's still the theory, but
yeah, we've definitely got away from that, not just here in New Mexico, but as we saw recently with the Biden administration and their vaccine mandate, the liberals on the Supreme Court were A-okay with pretty much anything that Joe Biden wanted to do, as long as he could somehow plausibly connect it to fighting COVID-19, regardless of the Congress and the role that they are supposed to play, which is indeed sad. It's sad that we really hung by a thread there, and only the election of Donald J. Trump and the 3 Supreme Court justices that he was able to get on the court helped keep the balance of power somewhat at a reasonable level. But boy, the idea of the legislation of the United States and the state of New Mexico coming from the Congress or the legislature is something that we've definitely gotten away from. A few bills round up. HB 75, Public Banking Act, creating a government-run bank in New Mexico. I think folks can see that's a bad idea. Even our progressive liberal legislature thought the same, and at least it's been killed in a committee 6-3.
It's always tough to pick the worst legislation of any session, but that always should be in the top 2 or 3. So
Yeah, very bad bill. I testified on it against, of course, yesterday. Now, an intriguing one, HB 72, introduced by Matthew McQueen and Jason Harper, so a progressive Democrat and a Republican there. Space ticket gross receipts. Now, we asked this question a while back because to us it does not appear that the spaceport tickets, the exemption that they've been given by the legislature on payloads, should apply to people going into space. But the Tax and Rev Department gave a very deferential ruling to the folks at Virgin Galactic, and this bill was to clarify that that exemption, that deduction, technically a deduction, did not apply to tickets sold at the spaceport. The gross receipts tax, our favorite thing to talk about. It's supposed to include these things unless specifically exempted, and it does not have a specific exemption. Unfortunately, I think between the Virgin Galactic lobbying capacity and a lot of ignorance among legislators about this issue, it died as well. So kind of a rare thing for the Rio Grande Foundation to be supporting anything that increases revenues. But when you have, kind of that equitable treatment, there should be equitable treatment of these kinds of things. And at least it should be a legislative decision to not tax ticket sales for Virgin Galactic, but we know the spaceport doesn't necessarily play by the same rules as the rest of us do.
Yeah, and it is ironic, when they talk about taxing Social Security, they're so concerned that maybe some rich people might get a small benefit, even though the overwhelming majority of benefit will go to middle class and lower income people. But somehow in the spaceport, tickets costing tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, largely purchased by the most affluent of the affluent, can't afford to pay gross receipts tax. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. And I'm with you, Paul. So anyone says that you and the Rio Grande Foundation have never supported a tax on anything, the exception makes the rule, but as you say, the equity issue involved with this one is very stark.
Yeah, and believe it or not, and you could probably look back and find very, very few bills on which this has happened. The Rio Grande Foundation and Voices for Children testified on the same side of an issue, and we've talked at length about kind of the way Voices tends to work, and often they forego progressive policies or support regressive policies. For example, film subsidies and free college tuition, two policies that any progressive should join us in lockstep and oppose those kinds of things, but they tend not to. But on that bill, they actually were there, and unfortunately, the spaceport is even more persuasive than the Voices for Children and Rio Grande Foundation combined, which is pretty amazing. SB 8, this is the voting bill that the governor and most of the kind of liberals in the legislature are supporting. 16 and 17-year-olds voting. There's issues like whether you should have a permanent list of folks who can get a ballot mailed to them, an absentee ballot, registering people to vote on online using a Social Security number, and burdening Motor Vehicle Division with more in the way of voter registration activities. This bill was much more problematic when it was first introduced. It's still bad, but they were including a lot of priorities, straight ticket voting, and you could collect votes or ballots until Friday after the election.
Yeah, so the election would go on well past election day or the day after.
Really terrible stuff. SB 8 is still one of the worst bills in the session. Simply 16 and 17-year-olds voting is a terrible, terrible idea. But, it's kind of not, it's in that maybe top 5 or 10 bad bills. And it's definitely one of the governors and the progressives' preferred bills of the session, their top priorities, because they got to keep that narrative up that everything that they're doing is to save democracy, when in reality, it's just a political agenda for them.
Yeah, and it is interesting. You see polls about the rules around elections, and it's pretty broad that Americans are pretty clear that they like there to be a set of fair and equitable rules around elections. But the progressive view can easily go against that and doesn't seem to get much pushback, particularly in places like New Mexico.
Yeah, now there's a lot going on in the legislature, and we will continue to keep track of it as best we can. Of course, I highly recommend folks following heirsoфenchantment.com for lists of some of the best and worst bills, as well as further analysis of some important bills being discussed. I know the Clean Fuel Standard, SB 14, is in another committee today. That's probably SB 8 was probably my worst bill at one time, and then it got amended, and it's not that bad. It's still bad. SB 14, the Clean Fuel Standard, is probably taken its place. So by all means, also we're going to be tracking the votes at the Freedom Index, RioGrandeFoundation.org. But we are going to move to other interesting and important news items. And boy, Wally, when Texas had its, and I don't follow the Texas media as closely as I do New Mexico's, obviously, but it's fair to say that what happened last February in Texas was pretty surprising to folks down there in terms of the windmills not turning and gas lines having some trouble freezing. And what happened is ultimately people lost electricity for 3 or 4 days. As I understand it, that's primarily what they lost is electricity. If the same happens this summer in New Mexico, they can't say that they haven't been warned, because, boy, the Santa Fe New Mexican, in addition to previous articles they've written, articles I've written across the state, headline, Santa Fe New Mexican, January 28th, PNM, summertime could include rotating outages. That is a very stark headline, and something that I think all New Mexicans, especially those who get power from PNM, need to be concerned about.
Yeah, we've had our personal generator discussions over the past many months, and this is a indication that maybe that would be important for you. It's one of those things to have planned rolling blackouts is it's a big hindrance and causes lots and lots of issues. And only California seems to be in a position where they've had to deal with those repetitively. But, Paul, you have people that are on oxygen machines, other things. It's tough on businesses. It's very inefficient. It's tough on law enforcement. So, there's huge costs if that's the case. And the fact that PNM is wringing their hands so publicly so early shows that indeed, they must think there's a problem. It appears to me from afar they were probably looking for their merger to solve some of their short-term power problems. And now that merger has been shut down for at least the time being, they're having to go it alone with their own resources, and they're saying they're not up to the challenge right now.
Yeah, and a few quotes from this article. Tom Falgren, Vice President for Energy Generation at PNM, said the utility currently has no reserve margin for July and August, adding temporary outages aren't out of the question. And then another quote that I think is interesting, and we've talked about the shuttering of San Juan Generating Station. Of course, this is all being driven by the passage and the enactment of the Energy Transition Act.
And PNM's response to it as well.
True.
So, yeah.
That, of course, was a 2019 bill, a top priority of our governor and the Democrats in the legislature at the time. Something that we fought against, and we were pretty unique in fighting against at the Rio Grande Foundation. So this is all stuff that we kind of looked into our crystal ball and thought we could see this happening. But PNM has apparently filed with the Public Regulation Commission in a filing that could keep the San Juan Generating Station open beyond June, its supposed closing date, according to the Energy Transition Act. And that's really and Wally, I need to buy you a beer or two because you mentioned tipping point twice earlier in the podcast. I have to throw it out there again. So we don't just call the podcast tipping point. We call it tipping point for a reason. Well, the tipping point of this whole energy pyramid we're dealing with is the San Juan Generating Station shutting down. And if they are able to somehow get approval from the PRC to essentially defy state law and keep the San Juan Generating Station open, that could definitely do the trick to keep the lights on around here throughout the August and July and August time period.
Yeah, and one of the things, and I've talked about this briefly on other podcasts, is also there are power sharing arrangements where the excess capacity of different companies in different states, it's allowed to flow back and forth. But as the electric industry has so quickly gotten out of the coal business, just shutting them down one after the other, there's a lot less of that. And then they're having trouble getting their new gas plants online in a timely fashion, definitely having a tough time getting their wind and solar and battery projects online. And as those wind and solar and battery come online, they've been unproven. And, in places like California, the California Independent System Operator doesn't even give full credit to those resources as being useful in keeping the lights on a hottest day of the year or hot day of the year or whatever. So there's a lot of issues to be considered going forward in that. And the other one is, will PNM give back some of the costs that they were given in terms of stranded asset treatment because they actually end up having to use San Juan Generating Station longer? These are all good questions, and we'll just have to see what the answers are in the coming months.
Yeah, and I will only say that summer will have its own challenges and problems. Of course, I like the air conditioning to come on when I turn the button or put it at the level that the house gets too hot otherwise. But obviously, we are heading into a potential winter storm situation as we talk here in New Mexico. It is also good to have energy available to folks when they need it. And this is not just a convenience thing. This is a life and death situation for a lot of folks, as we saw in Texas last winter. And heaven forbid, we don't want to see that kind of thing happen here in New Mexico. But a new study has made some wild claims about natural gas appliances in your home. And I'm big on diversifying my energy portfolio in my home, not being all electric as our Senator Martin Heinrich would like us to be, but having electricity, but also having a stove and gas heat. And these are traditionally seen as they are correctly clean sources of heat and energy in our homes. But this study came out saying, well, first and foremost, and this is the study, I'm going to give you the rebuttal as we talk through it, that your stove, when it's just sitting there, it's leaking natural gas out into your home, and that this is causing problems for your health and the family and the environment. Well, you would be able to smell natural gas. This is the response, of course. We have this at airsofenchantment.com, including the link to the energy in-depth refutation of this study. The original report made national headlines. It was on Yahoo News and throughout newspapers. But Utilities add something, mercaptan, to give
Yeah,
that
mercaptans.
mercaptan.
Yep.
I that's a tough word to pronounce.
No problem.
They give the rotten egg smell, and so you would be smelling. And if you do smell rotten eggs, especially here in this snowstorm we're expecting, you definitely want to get out of your house, or at least turn the natural gas off very quickly, because you have a serious issue. But if you had a perpetual leak in your house, from your stove or whatever, you would smell that. It wouldn't just be an odorless smell. Another part of their original study is that they encased the kitchen area of the home in plastic to cut off any ventilation. Now, if you're cooking, there is gas burning. It does help to have a ventilated area. You often have a fan right above your head there that you can turn on. Mostly that's when somebody burns something and you need to clear out the area. But doing a study in a artificially non-ventilated area is certainly not realistic. And then one of the study's authors told NPR that to fix leaks in your stove, ideal is to go electric, but if you can't, you should just pull the stove out from the wall and tighten the connectors to the stove and to the nearby pipes.
And Paul,
not a good idea.
Well, and it's actually counter to the plumbing and utility codes many places, is that the work needs to be done by licensed plumbers to make those connections and make sure they're secure. And so in addition to maybe having all their other facts wrong, their solution is something that in a lot of jurisdictions is illegal and in many cases is unwise. So
dangerous, yes.
Yes.
Okay, and finally, while there's a lot of issues going on in the legislature, legislation flying around, and then we'll be heading quickly into the election in November, most people are thinking governor, Secretary of State, Attorney General, House of Representatives. There's a lot of issues, but we will be asked as voters to tap into that permanent fund in New Mexico and create a universal pre-K program. Well, a new report, because there are states, including some red states like Tennessee, which darn it has a lot of conservative policies in place. They also have a state-run pre-K program. And guess what? This new report, using data from Tennessee, actually finds that universal programs like this are harmful. They actually do real harm both to educational gains, which were not there by sixth grade, but the kids who attended were performing worse on behavioral metrics relative to their peers. I've got a link to the study. It's at reason.com. You can see it for yourself. It'll eventually make its way up to errorsoфenchantment.com, but it's by Peter Suderman, 12622 at reason.com. State-run pre-K resulted in worse educational behavioral outcomes for kids. So we will be hearing a lot about this, predominantly from our left-wing Voices for Children and media outlets, etc. This is not the first study to not just poo-poo, but counter the supposed benefits of pre-K programs. But, it's common sense. Taking kids out of the home at a very young age, 2, 3, 4, sticking them in an institutional setting where a government employee deals with them pretty much every single day is not optimal for our children. And this study just shows that in real scientific terms.
Yeah, Paul, I've thought about this issue a lot in terms of what things are effective, and it's one of those, there are parenting styles, particularly from the time children are born until they're, 2, 3, or 4, that have been shown to be super, super important that many, many parents know about, but not all do. So, maybe a parent class might be something. Is like, you want to help your children get ahead and develop in the best way possible. But it seems like a program without a teachers union component is nothing that many jurisdictions want to even look into. So,
yep. Well, we'll have to leave it there, Wally. A lot going on. We'll continue again. Folks can, as floor votes happen, check out how we're rating the bills at the Rio Grande Foundation.org website with the legislative tracker, the Freedom Index there. And I encourage people, we're basically in a virtual session and for all intents and purposes, and it is extremely easy to, if you know what bills you're interested in, to put a few notes together and do a virtual testimony to the legislature. I've been up to Santa Fe twice now, and the Roundhouse is a singularly uninviting place to go, especially for conservatives. Never the most inviting place to go, but with all the vaccine requirements, the metal detectors, and everything else, not a lot of people going up there, and the committee process is much different than it has been in traditional non-COVID years. So thank you for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.